Are you personally afraid of getting COVID? No. One of the things that you learn when you travel abroad, especially to developing countries that have endemic diseases that are quite nasty, like I've been throughout Africa, and there they have malaria and things like loss of fever and all kinds of horrible things that are quite bad. Like there are certain places where they have hantavirus outbreaks and 30% mortality rate. Is you develop a sense of proportionality and you say, okay, for me, the things I do, am I high risk, mid risk, low risk? And if I do contract this, what's the progression look like? And honestly, how problematic is this going to be for me? Now, 33 years old, reasonably good shape, reasonably healthy, and my nutrition's good, take my vitamin D. So if I was to contract COVID, the odds are I would barely notice it. And that's just a fact. Most people who contract it are asymptomatic or have mild symptoms, as we are seeing through antibody analysis and extrapolation. Now, the problem is that we live in a media environment where fear porn has been turned up to 11, and they have convinced every single person they can that if you contract COVID, it's going to leave permanent, devastating damage to you. And even if you survive, you're going to have long COVID, lose your taste, not be able to get out of bed, not be able to go to the bathroom without assistance. There's a middle ground between recognizing proportionality and risk to yourself and living in this fear bizarro world where we have to fear each other and everybody's out to get you and so forth. And it's just saying, okay, reasonable precautions can be taken until the high-risk individuals are de-risked. Then it does make sense to have some preventive health measures for their protection. Okay, and they don't have to be draconian. They can just simply be avoid large gatherings, wash hands, wear a mask, these types of things. And if we just did that, it would slow the spread of the disease to a point where therapeutics and vaccination programs can completely de-risk the at-risk people. In which case, those preventive measures, those slow spread measures are no longer necessary and they should go away. The problem is that we just can't do that as a society. There's just too much loss of trust in institutions. There's too much anger, and then there's too much double standard that exists. If you have a family member die, you can't have a large funeral. When a civil rights leader dies, they can have a 10,000 person funeral. When you want to get your hair, cut and cleaned and styled, you can't go to the hair salon, but political leaders can. You can't have Thanksgiving, but political leaders can. You can't travel, but political leaders can go to Cabo. And there are hundreds of these examples throughout. We can't have large gatherings unless they're politically motivated with one particular ideology. If you're of another ideology, you're going to die of the virus and it's a super spreading event. If it's another ideology, totally fine, not going to public health problem, and so forth. When you politicize an event, you lose the ability to manage the event, because no matter what makes sense from a common sense and a practical everyday mechanism, you now have to look at everything through a political lens. And if whatever you're told doesn't agree with the political ideology you hold, everything goes to hell. And all authority figures lose all credibility. And this is the greatest tragedy, I think, of COVID. There were ways in the early days of this pandemic to be able to mitigate it to a point where it would have not been problematic, as Taiwan did, and Vietnam did, and other nations like New Zealand did. Do that. Now, basic facts, like if you inoculate, vaccinate everybody over the age of 55, just do that. 92% of those who die will no longer die. Just that one thing. And those are numbers from the Centers for Disease Control. When you look at the raw COVID mortality rate. And many of you point out, oh, well, how do we know those are real COVID deaths? Because if you die COVID positive, regardless of how you died, that's still reported as a COVID death. Another example of politicization, another example of distrust in institutions. It's actually a valid concern. you should separate statistics and look at people whose primary cause of death was COVID versus statistics where they happened to be COVID positive while they died. And they tell a very different story, actually, when that's done. That said, this is still a nasty disease. You have to live in the middle when you look at these things. It does exist. And for those who have problems with it, they're horrendous. And there are still people who wear oxygen 9 months after catching it. There's still people, their taste hasn't returned. There's still people with heart damage. There's still people with brain damage and other problems. And these are terrible, terrible problems. And we're going to have hundreds of thousands of people running around after this pandemic is over in the United States who have permanent disabilities as a consequence of contracting COVID. Not a good situation at all. So it does exist, and it is a problem, but there is proportionality. And the shaming, the brutal attacks that people have done, the virtue signaling of, well, you're not wearing a mask. The governor of Wyoming got COVID. They brutally attacked him. The governor of Colorado, who was always wearing a mask, and always, he and his husband both got COVID. It's a highly infectious, novel viral agent. With avian flu, 90 million Americans were infected. Everybody gets infected with these things. Mask or not, just slows the spread down. I think in the future, we need to take a step back and say, moving forward, what is the long-term social response to this? First off, any pandemic-causing pathogen, the vast majority of them can be vaccinated against. As a consequence, we can pre-make all the 1 and 2 clinical trials for most of those so that if we ever get into a pandemic, we can bring a vaccine to market in 3 to 4 months. Second, we need to have an honest conversation in the United States about vaccine hesitancy. Some of this is propaganda spread by Russians and Chinese and other actors specifically to attempt to damage society, because they understand if we retard in vaccine rates, what that means is that we're going to have a slower economic recovery. So it's a high impact, low cost attack. So you just spread a bunch of junk. The vaccines kill people. The vaccines cause cancer. The vaccines cause HIV. The vaccines change your genes. The vaccines are part of a New World Order conspiracy. The vaccines are going to cause permanent health consequences and so forth. And a lot of people just deeply, deeply, deeply believe that. Some people for religious reasons, they say, oh, the vaccines have fetal DNA and tissue and other things in them. How would an mRNA vaccine have that? It makes no sense at all. You make them synthetically in a lab. They have nothing to do with that. But we have Catholic bishops saying that to their parishioners and saying you cannot get inoculated because it's against our religious principles. So we have to have a serious national conversation. And the reality is that we will not be able to restore trust in these things until institutional trust is restored. So vaccine hesitancy is a symptom, not a root cause of a broader social problem of people just simply don't trust their government. And to be frank, why should they? The US government in particular has repeatedly lied to all of us again and again and again and again. From the Iraq War, weapons of mass destruction. Oh, well, I guess they didn't have that. To Obamacare, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. There's a million lies, small and large, and it's gotten to a point where there's bipartisan agreement that our institutions are pathological liars, and there's no accountability, and when they commit problems, they create issues, there's no punishment for that. So they say, let's say there's a 5% chance that these vaccines are problematic. If that is the case, there's no liability. Nobody will go to jail. No one will go out of business. No politician will lose their job. He'll just move on and say, oh, well. You can't operate a society where people are given a mandate to lie to the mainstream. They get away with that. And then when their lies result in harm or damage to society, there's no recourse for that. That's how you get a civil war. And that's where we're marching towards. It's every election cycle that gets worse and worse and worse. So above and beyond what we need to do to get out of this, the next thing we need to do is really have a serious conversation about institutions and how the hell are we going to restore faith in institutions, if that's even possible or not. And number three, I think everybody has to be aware that the world is complex and nuanced, and we do need institutions to navigate it. In the olden days, before mainstream society, we had religion. That was the anchor that allowed people to navigate complex existence. Why did this happen? Because God said so, good or bad. The Dark Ages, these other things, they had a religious way of looking at the world for scientific, medical, political, and economic and warfare consequences. Okay? Then we moved into the Enlightenment, and then suddenly society said to figure out complexity, you have to use a scientific method, and you have to use thinking tools and deductive reasoning, and you can gradually put pieces together and figure out how things are running. We have now moved to a post-Enlightenment where the world has become too complex for anyone to understand. I can't understand it. Bill Gates can't understand it. Elon Musk can't understand it. It's too complex and interdependent, interconnected. Okay, there's so much going on. Cosmological things going on, aerospace things going on, biological things, computer science. The rate of innovation is doubling every 18 months. It's crazy. There's too much data. The point of institutions is to handle that complexity. You create institutions to manage and handle complexity. I build a business to do business at a scale that I cannot do. I build a hospital to provide medical care to people on a scale that a doctor cannot do. Okay? Small, large, gargantuan institutions are there to get things done. People don't trust institutions. There's a social regression, and what they need to do then is look at complex things as simple and get black and white answers. Cure, no care. Lethal, not lethal. Enemy, friend. In my camp, out of my camp. Good actor, bad actor. And you can't do that. You'll have a horrible outcome if you go down that way. And you end up having highly polarized people who Dunning-Kruger their way throughout life. And they end up hating each other for crazy reasons. And just honestly, deep in their core, believing that the world works in a very simple way. It does not. So it is super important for the durability and survivability of the human race. We find a way to restore faith in institutions so that we can deal with the complexity of the 21st century. And if we cannot do that, well, then we're done as a species. The only way to manage society will be extinction or dictatorship.